Um, Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming here. It's a packed room. I have a few remarks I want to make before I kind of launch into the core aspect of the talk that I prepared for today. I agreed freely and of my own will to clear the air, as they say, about a few issues that have preempted the talk today. The main one is relative to my very active Twitter account, and in particular a tweet from November 2020 regarding the University of Dallas and the formation of this particular group. I'd like to say it's just sort of two things about this, and we'll see. This isn't really what I came to talk about, but these two things happen to be true in my case. I'm a Texan. I was born in Brownsville, and I was raised in the hill country. Played high school football, the whole 9 yards. I identify as a Texan. The moment we drove into the Texas part of Texarkana, I wanted to get down and kiss the ground. I love Texas. On the other hand, I'm a Roman Catholic, cradle Catholic, as they say, raised in a full-time lay Catholic missionary family, attended Franciscan University of Steubenville. And the reason I say those things about being a Texan and being a Roman Catholic is that for me, there's two things that I think I hold in some high regard. The first is that there's a lot of honor cultures in the world. There's a lot of people from different places who take words and signs and handshakes and all that kind of stuff seriously. But in my upbringing and my formation, part of being a Texan was to give your word directly, freely, without coercion, but to make that word count as a matter of honor. And so I just want everyone to know that speaking on behalf of the University of Dallas, I have been contacted and had a really substantive exchange through correspondence with, I'm sorry, Tammy, I forgot your last name.
Leonard.
Yeah, Provost Dr. Leonard. And I've given my word to Dr. Leonard, not only about this event, but also with regard to a suggestion that I consider perhaps deleting the tweet, which is I actually don't do. My Twitter accounts have been open for over 10 years. I thought a lot about it. I'm a tenured professor at the University of British Columbia. I'm not who I was in the hill country, and I'm fairly well protected, including by a contract I signed for this talk. And I realized, you know what? I need to delete that tweet because I think I actually have the leverage here. I think I am in a position where I could have said, no, I don't want to, or what have you. But I deleted the tweet freely, out of my own free will, without coercion, and as a sign of goodwill and kindness and in charity. And so that matters to me as a Texan, that I gave my word, I kept my word, and I plan to keep that tonight. And I hope that that bond that I've made on behalf of the University of Dallas will be in full play today, Texan or not Texan in the room. Now, I'm also a Roman Catholic. That means I take institutional authority kind of seriously. And so whenever someone contacts me that has the ability to speak within the jurisdiction of an institution, I respect them. I don't know if I would respond in the same way if it wasn't the provost, to be honest. But I also want to say that it's not just a matter of personal upbringing or biography, but it's also a matter of a certain kind of religious principle that I take that seriously. And so for those two reasons, being a Texan, being a Roman Catholic, and certainly other ones we might say, I feel at least that I have tried to engage in a respectful way, and I'll try to continue doing that today. If anybody has any concerns, though, about this, I don't want to shut down the conversation about that, but I frankly didn't come to talk about that. So feel free to email me, feel free to contact me in any way that you'd like. And if you do so in a respectful and good way, I'll respond right back to you in the same way I responded to our provost. So now I want to get started. I'm an alum of Franciscan University of Steubenville. And whenever I decided to go to Steubenville, I had two colleges that I thought I would go to. One was UD and one was Steubenville. I had a mentor who is the district attorney for McCulloch County, who him and his wife had both attended UD. They loved this place. And they really encouraged me to go there. I went to a conference in Louisiana in Alexandria, where I was able to have a confession with Bishop Sam Jacobs, and I took the privilege of that time to ask him after my absolution and penance, where should I go to college? And he said, you can't do wrong with UD or, so he punted the ball. Nonetheless, Annie Hickman was the leader of the Young Apostles that year. He was in his senior year. He left the University of Texas to go to Franciscan, and he really sold me on, you go to Franciscan. And for that reason and others that I won't get into, I did. I was in the honors program. I was a philosophy student. I studied Spanish literature. And I have to admit, we were really insecure about y'all. TAC, UD, Notre Dame, all of us in the honors program were all like, wow, are we the stupid little flunkies that the smart kids who went to, you know, all these, and I'll be honest, I'm probably still nervous today. Like, I hope I'm smart enough to talk at UD. One thing that consoles me is that, and I ran into him earlier, is that my teacher, sophomore year, ancient Greek philosophy, was newly minted assistant professor, J.J. Sanford. And so he was a teacher of mine. We played basketball against each other. He was on the intramural faculty and staff team. I think he sets moving screens, but the ref seems to side with him. The point is, I saw him in the weight room. I saw him in the classroom. I saw him on the basketball court, and I have an immense respect for him and his career. And whenever he left Franciscan to come to UD as a dean at the time, I was really like, there we go. Now the Franciscans are showing, you know, their intellectual mettle. Another reason, though, beyond my insecurities in terms of being a Franny alum, is that he went to SUNY Buffalo and he studied with a really interesting philosopher by the name of Jorge Gracia. And Gracia, because he was Sanford's thesis advisor, he came out with a book called Latinos in America that put forward and kind of coalesced his philosophy of race, his work in philosophy of race, and in particular, a very kind of needle-nosed argument for a familial historical view of race. And that argument, I was directed towards it in part out of affection for my former teacher, but it also brought me to the doorstep of the Black intellectual tradition, because his familial historical view, that is Jorge Gracia, begins with W.B. Du Bois's sociological theory of race, and it kind of sees that as the foundation of philosophy of race in the work he does and in the work that English language philosophy continues on doing today. And so that introduction and that bringing to the doorstep of philosophy of race informs kind of the opening formative moments of my journey that'll inform some of this talk. And the other part that informs it, ironically, is the stuff I started with, that I've been a Catholic for a long time. I've been formed in the church, and I'm a practicing, confessing Catholic today as well. And the Catholic intellectual tradition is a great treasure in my life. So that's how I got to eventually critical race theory from W.B. Du Bois, Jorge Gracia, and how I got to the church was basically, you know, infant baptism. But anyway, my key source for critical race theory, because I do think there are better and worse sources out there, and there are some I actually don't like very much, is a reader. It's a compilation of articles from 1995. It's called Critical Race Theory, The Key Writings That Formed the Movement. And it's an edited collection by Kimberly Crenshaw and a number of readers, published by the New Press in 1995. I'm going to pretty much stick to that reader. It has a lot of different articles that were published during mostly the 80s and the early 90s. In terms of my core sources, I'm not going to do quote citations or anything like that. But if you're wondering, that to me is really the place to dig in. Another place to dig in, if you're looking for maybe something that's not just primary text, but that's a little more accessible, would be, well, the introduction to that reader, which is fantastic, and the foreword to it by Cornel West, who is not a critical race theorist, but it is someone who sees critical race theory, in particular its distinction from critical legal studies, as an important contribution to the larger project of abolitionist Black thought in the United States of America. Another place you can go to is alsoacarpenter.com, which is the website of Bradley Mason, who in my opinion is the best translator, interpreter of critical race theory for Christians. He's, I believe, a Protestant who has studied critical race theory really deeply and offered non-superficial accounts of it at his website, also at carpenter.com. He's also corrected me and given me some really good critical engagement on some of my maybe earlier accounts, both in interviews to journalists and in my own media, that I've benefited from greatly. And I'm going to even mention one of them that he's changed my mind on a bit here. I guess the first question is, what in the world is an intersection? Because this is about the intersection of critical race theory and Catholic social teaching. I think it's important to really get clear what this intersection metaphor means. An intersection is where sects or sections meet across, and I mean a cross. So there's a difference between this and this. This is an intersection. It's where two sects or sections meet across. This overlap is really just sort of two things being more or less identical to each other, or it's a sort of total compatibility thesis. I'm not here to make this argument. I'm not here to make a compatibility thesis argument. I'm not here to argue for a total similarity between critical race theory and Catholic social teaching. I think it's an interesting challenge. As a philosopher, I'm attracted to that challenge, but it's not one I can in good faith make today here from what I've read and from what I know. I'm here to make an intersectional argument for these two sects or sections that I think do overlap in key places and in key moments and in ways that I'll argue for with some examples and evidence and so forth. So I think it's really important to not over-determine the argument of intersection. So I tend to work as a philosopher on the Goldilocks rule. When I make a claim, I don't want to over-determine the claim too high. I also don't want to under-determine the claim too cold. In the midst of the rhetoric of making the claim, I'm going to be inclined to probably over-determine it more than I will be to under-determine it. So before I start, I want to warn everyone, if I get too worked up here rhetorically, if I start preaching or something, please remember, this is an intersectional argument, not an argument for total correspondence or for two things being identical. And if you feel I crossed the line in some way, just let me know and I'd be happy to maybe moderate back from the rhetorical presentation. In the aim of being intersectional and not, across and not otherwise, I want to make 2 points of moderation. The first is that it seems clear to me that critical race theory addresses something very specific. And this is somewhat controversial amongst critical race theorists, but I think they would agree in general that they're really talking about white supremacy in the context of the United States of America, and maybe more largely within the sort of transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, indigenous dispossession, colonialism, that sort of thing across the Americas, but with a really kind of laser focus on the effects of the institution of slavery, both the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery. By the way, you may wonder why transatlantic and chattel. The transatlantic slave trade was actually abolished in the very early 19th century. Before that, in fact, they said you couldn't use boats for it, and then they outright abolished it. But that didn't abolish chattel slavery. In fact, it actually, in some ways, perversely created this chattel logic, where all of a sudden now the institution of slavery in the South had to be built and kept there because it couldn't be simply exported through the Middle Passage. So I use the expression transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery for a reason here. And we can see this kind of progression continue. And critical race theory exists within the abolitionist tradition that goes all the way back to the second and third great awakenings of the Quakers in the 17th and 18th century that were committed to the abolition of slavery, that created the free states, for instance, like Pennsylvania. And that over time, of course, were joined by many other allies, including the enslaved themselves, and always as a part of this, the enslaved themselves. But that's really the focus of critical race theory in this context. It's addressing white supremacy in this particular historical context. Catholic social teaching is addressing xenophobia globally. And I think it's reasonable to say that xenophobia, fear of the other, as an idea of what we mean when we talk about racism, for instance, or race, is probably somewhat categorically distinct from the specificity of white supremacy in this context. I had a student from Ethiopia, and he's a Black Ethiopian man. And in Amharic, there's no real word that approximates the word race or racism. There's words that are more like ethnos or nation or familyhood or these kinds of equivalents. So he would oftentimes say the thing like, there is no racism in Ethiopia. And what he meant was there's no word for it. But he could talk about racism in the Canadian context that made sense to him based on language. And to be honest, I found it very confusing and difficult to always understand what we were talking about. But over time, I came to understand, in fact, that not only are there differences between forms of xenophobia that are quite old, but that different contexts do, in some sense, including through their languaging, create a kind of exchange that sometimes builds some untranslatables. And I do think there are some untranslatables between critical race theory in English, American English, and the kind of globalized universal voice of the church talking about xenophobia to the world and all people of goodwill. So that's the first point of moderation. Second point is that critical race theory is an American legal theory built in the American Academy, and in particular in an institution called the law school, which is itself a sort of an invention of in New Haven and a few other places. I got to hear an interesting, some might say boring, but I thought it was fascinating, history of how sort of Yale Law School went from being essentially a saloon to one of the most prestigious legal institutions in the world. CRT really was built inside of this institution called the American Law School, and built through academic exchange, primarily through writing articles in peer-reviewed journals. And that's where we find most of the deposit of critical race theory. There's a tension here, because a lot of critical race theorists wanted to say that what happened in civil rights movement on the streets ought to be included into civil rights law that's taught in the classroom. And this was a point of hot debate, and it's still being debated today. And so it's not a perfect account. It's not only academic, but I think we can say in a reasonable way that it's an academic phenomenon when compared to Catholic social teaching, which is an ecclesial set of teachings that are really pastorally delivered pastorally to the world through the institution, of course, of the Roman Catholic Church. Here we find an interesting similar tension in that while the church speaks to the world through the institution of the church, there have been movements, including movements that have interfaced, now we get closer with critical race theory, that have said, when the church speaks to the world, what happens on the streets matters too. Movements like liberation theology, but also movements like Vatican II and the Catholic social teaching tradition that begins, I would date, in about 1892 with Rerum Novarum and continues at least through papal encyclicals, councils, and whatnot until Fratelli Tutti of last year. So one is academic, one is ecclesial, with some tensions. I don't think these are going to be perfect fits, but I think they show us that while not identical, there are some similarities that we can begin to take a look at as intersections. And so I'm going to now try and give you 10 intersections, 10 points of intersection between critical race theory and Catholic social teaching. I'll admit, I'm kind of just throwing seed here and seeing how it goes and betting that maybe I'll land a couple things here and there, and maybe you'll get rid of a few. And you know, each of these probably deserves a much more thoughtful, considered, and deeper dive. And all of them can have some kind of overlaps where you can say, isn't that point the same as the other one? You know, okay, fair enough. But I'm nonetheless going to try and package these as 12 separate points that I'll enumerate, give the titles that I've assigned to them, and then I'll go through and talk about what I mean by those specific titles from there. So this is the bulk of the talk, having hopefully made some points of moderation and also explain what I mean by an intersection and what I don't mean by an intersection, not this, all right? So the 10 intersections I claim between critical race theory and Catholic social teaching are the following. One, they're both an intellectual critique and history. 2, civil rights and natural law. They both contain an affirmative disposition to those 2 positions. 3, a little bit generic, I admit, new and old. I promise when I explain, you'll see what I mean, but I get it that you could say that about a lot of things. 4 is a sense of moral realism. And I'll explain a bit more of what I mean by moral realism there. 5 is that they're both constructive and active. And again, I'll give a better sense of what that means when I talk about it. 6 is that they're both a critique of the political status quo. In particular here, I'll give a teaser: modernity, liberalism, and the moral limits of secularism, the secular liberal state. 7, democratic and pluralistic, with some very noted critics and dissenters on this point. But I'm going to here favor the democratic and pluralistic forms of the traditions of Catholic social teaching and critical race theory. Their opponents, I think, matter too, and I'll say a bit about that. 8 is that you can find them both within the intellectual, at least, tradition, but also the people of what I'm going to call Afro/Latin Catholicism. So you don't have to find them all in a different space if you're looking at an Afro-Latin. So this would include both Afro-Latins, but also African and also Latin American. So kind of packaging that all up with the postmodern dash. 9 is they're both forms of abolitionist, explicitly abolitionist anti-racism. And 10, they're both deeply autocritical. So they both critique themselves, autocritical coalitions. So they both have a strong sense of forms of association that internally are often in contestation with one another. All right. So those are the 10 that I wanted to enumerate here, and I'll just go through them one by one and say a few words about them. Sister. Josephine is here. All right. You didn't tell me you were coming. Perfect. Okay. All right. Oh, Lord. So the first one is that both, I claim, critical race theory and Catholic social teaching are informed critiques of overly ideological types of, scare quotes, scientific or vulgar Marxism, or exclusively Marxist European critical theories, such as the Frankfurt School or even the Birmingham School, we might say. Both critical race theory and Catholic social teaching look a bit askance at this. In the case of critical race theory, they parted company with critical legal studies, which was largely influenced by the Frankfurt School on this issue of vulgar Marxism. Irony is that critical legal studies accused the scientific Marxists of kind of the same thing. So I'm not saying that it was a clean and easy break, but it was nonetheless a break that was built on this critique of an over-reliance on heavy ideological Hegelian theory, favoring instead story and testimony, concrete examples, like Pope Francis in his apostolic letter. I think it's translated in English as like the joy of the gospel. He talks about how reality matters more than ideas. This sense, and Derek Bell has this sense of legal realism. A lot of times in the law, especially whenever we look at laws pertaining to race that never use the term race in them, and we have constitutional amendments, of course, that include this, but also consequential cases like Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, whatnot. The apologia on behalf of ostensibly racist laws was, there's no word race in here. How can you talk about race? And Bell said, well, a legal realist talks about not just the ideas in the sort of, semiotics of the text, the language, but about how is this affecting people and what is this intended to do? And what's the context that explains why this law is coming into effect, so on and so forth. So I think that we see that in both critical race theory and Catholic social teaching, there is a bit of a prioritization of the concrete, of the testimonial, of even the anecdotal. And ironically, some of this priority comes from other theoretical influences, namely influences from phenomenology, the return to things themselves, personalism, and also existentialism. And some would call Christian existentialism, Christian humanism, all these kinds of words that people pair around. So again, this isn't, I think this is a clear intersection, but it's a complex one. And I could give a whole talk on just this one, but I'm going to move on. So the second intersection is that both critical race theory and Catholic social teaching are rooted in a notion of civil rights and also natural law. Obviously, in the United States of America, we have the Civil War, we have the Civil Rights Movement, and it's interesting how they're kind of bookends of a certain kind. What's meant in the Civil Rights movement, though, was largely an invocation of what I think in Catholic social teaching we would identify, and I think rightly, as an appeal to natural law. Martin Luther King, in his letter to from a Birmingham jail, he quotes Aquinas in his Summa, where Aquinas himself is alluding to Augustine in Civitatis Dei and City of God. Lex in justa non est lex. This is King's translation. Declensions aren't clean, but it's a good translation. An unjust law is no law at all. What does that mean? It means that the law itself, insofar as it violates the natural law, does not bring the weight or does not carry the burdens of obedience that laws that are just would carry. This is not only clearly, but like he's literally quoting Aquinas, who's quoting Augustine, to appeal to this idea of natural rights. Now, I do find it interesting, but I can't go into it, that there are different natural rights traditions. The most consequential one in the United States and in England has been the John Finnis school, the Robert George school of natural rights. And that's one approach to natural rights. But I think there's also other approaches, and it's interesting to me how within critical race theory, we see a different maybe tradition of natural rights that's nonetheless rooted in the same key sources of Thomism, of Augustine's politics and political philosophy and moral philosophy as well. I'd love to tell you a story that just brings us together a little bit, just a touch more. Whenever Martin Luther King was jailed, someone snuck into the prison a copy of A Call to Unity, which was an essay penned by 9 white clergymen in the Birmingham area that never used Martin Luther King's name, but it referred to outsiders who had come into their town and stirred up a bunch of trouble. And they called for them to be civil, and they called for them to be to not perform forms of direct action and mutual aid. And it called for all Christians to come together as Christians in this one. And the story goes that this was snuck into King during a time when he's doing pretty poorly in jail. They didn't treat him very well. And he got so angry that he was able to find a pencil. And he started writing his letter in the margins of the letter to the Call to Unity. Eventually, his lawyer was able to get him a legal pad. And on that legal pad, he penned what, in my opinion, is probably the most consequential form of political correspondence or letters in the history of this country. I compare it to things like La Respuesta, written by Sor Juana Inés, or Bartolomé de las Casas, his letter to King Philip. You know, this I see this in the same tradition. Inés was a nun, and Las Casas is a servant of God. So nothing not Catholic here. When Francis came to America, he cited King and cited this letter as well. But King wrote back and said, let me tell you why I was in Birmingham. And let me tell you why I'm not an outsider. And why I was working with a group that actually has meetings here every year. And he not only did that, but then he said, but I was here on behalf of justice. And a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it continues and goes on and on and on. One of the signers of that letter of A Call to Unity was the auxiliary bishop of Mobile, Alabama, Bishop Joseph Aloysius Durick. He would go on to become the Bishop of Nashville. And something changed in Bishop Joseph Aloysius Durick. such that in 1994, when he passed away, the New York Times, in the obituary written for him, he was hailed as a civil rights leader and an advocate for social justice. And in that obituary, and also in his own words that the journalists quote from, Bishop Durick admits that that letter from a Birmingham jail had a profound effect on his heart. And then he went to Vatican II, and he witnessed the spirit of those meetings, and he understood more deeply the teachings that he took from that admonition of white moderates. I mean, it's a radical, aggressive letter from King. I hear it's on your core curriculum. Hallelujah. I wish it was on more of them. And you might say, but is that critical race theory? Well, it's in the critical race theory, the key writings that form the movement, particularly in an article written about the theology of Martin Luther King, which was lost by the critical legal studies scholars who are predominantly Marxist, secular, so on, but has been preserved in critical race theory through Bell and others who took seriously not only the Black activists on the streets, but also in the Black churches. Right? And so it's a part of the record. You can go and take a look and see. I'm not making up things. But I think that story of Bishop Durick is such a powerful example of a real historical and actual intersection between the foundation, one of the foundational texts of critical race theory, and Catholic social teaching in the spirit of Vatican II. And when you add the Francis coming in and talking to Congress and quoting Martin Luther King, I think that puts quite a cherry on top. So if I'm a betting man, I'll take my point number 2 over maybe all these other ones. But let me move on. This is a more maybe generic point, but it maybe allows me to say more about what these two things are. New and old. So critical race theory and Catholic social teaching are both 200 and 2,500 years old. It's a bit anachronistic to say that because, to be honest, critical race theory wasn't coined until about 1989. You know, these things tend to happen outside. But what I mean is that critical race theory and Catholic social teaching are not things that you can understand alone. So you can't just go like study like critical race theory. Like you can't read that reader and not be at least in some level aware of like the civil rights movement, the history of abolitionism, Du Bois, just, you know, from Souls of Black Folk to Black Reconstruction in America. Like, you know, you can't even read the articles without some entry ability to converse with their sources. And you know what? I think it's the same thing in Catholic social teaching. I don't think you can pick up Rerum Novarum and not know scripture and not know the church fathers and not know scholasticism. And I have a lot of beloved brothers and sisters, you know, hermanos separados, we say in Spanish, Protestants, who will sometimes do this thing they do with Catholicism, and I gently and with love say, that's nice. You should read another book, you know, and you know, Calvin is interesting. Maybe just read Augustine first, though. You know, the point though is that like both of these traditions are not things for someone to really start studying. And I've always said, like, if your kid is reading critical race theory in 3rd grade, they're in law school. Wow. That's amazing. That's awesome. If you're studying Catholic social teaching and you know, Christian moral principles or whatever, I don't know if that's frankly the place to study Catholic social teaching. You know, you might want to do Christology first and maybe some work on the Trinity and maybe read the Gospels and, you know, that kind of stuff. So these are not entry level traditions. They're old in that sense. And also they're new in the sense that Catholic social teaching is really the church after Vatican I saying, we need to engage with the modern world. We didn't think we did because we weren't sure if it was going to be around that long. It looks like it's not going anywhere. And so, you know, 1892, let's have a shout after the Second International, so on and so forth, industrialism booming around Europe, so on and so forth. And you see the church speaking to the world continually, speaking to they often subtweet. So they often speak to the world without naming. You know, Francis didn't say Bolsonaro. Francis didn't say any of the names we might think of, but we knew who he was talking about, right? And the same thing goes all the way across the tradition of Catholic social teachings. And it has all these great meetings, all these great moments of getting together, arguing, disputing things, so on and so forth. Traditions like Hellenism, the tradition of ancient Greek philosophy, Judaism, the Hebrew Bible, the prophets, the Psalms, abolitionism and this Quaker to ending the carceral state movement, contemporaries who aren't maybe Catholic social, like theologians who are like, I do Christology, I don't actually do Catholic. Okay, well, you're still on the team, right? You don't get kicked off because you do Christology or you study Origen or like, no. And, you know, even the way Origen turned out, you still get to be on the team, right? You know, and it's the same thing in Catholic and in critical race theory. Cornel West is not a critical race theorist. He's a philosopher. He wrote, you know, The American Invasion of Philosophy, A Genealogy of Pragmatism. He wrote Race Matters. He wrote Democracy Matters. He's never written a single thing other than the foreword to the critical race theory reader, where we can see that people like West, like Bell Hooks, like James Cone, who's a slightly more complicated figure because of Black theology of liberation, he was actually borrowing the Catholic Gutierrez language of Teología de Liberación, the theology of liberation. And he asked a Brazilian to write the foreword to that book in English by the name of Paulo Freire. So that gets even more complicated. But the point is that these are things that intersect in their sense of being non-entry level, part of an old and ongoing tradition, but also kind of new, and to be honest, still in dispute and still in formation. I don't think anyone can read Laudato Si and be like, oh yeah, we knew all this stuff. You know, that's, you know, Francis is, sure, he's repeating the words of many people, including others like Patriarch Bartholomew and all these others, but he's also talking about the Kyoto Agreement, and I've never seen that before. And so that's a sense of them being old and new. The next point is their moral realism. So both critical race theory and Catholic social teaching, and this is going to probably offend certain maybe more postmodern sensibilities, but they refuse to treat morality as being wholly contextual or as being deterministic. And they certainly both reject a kind of Manichaeanism, if I can use Augustine's phrase, this kind of Star Wars, you know, dualistic idea. And that allows them to simultaneously reject moral relativism on the one hand, while also resisting forms of moral absolutism. So Benedict XVI in his little two homilies he gave to some bishops, actually I think one of them was here in Dallas, in his little book, Ignatius Press put it out as On Conscience. He talks about the reduction to objectivity. He calls this the great threat to mankind in that piece. We also know what he said about the dictatorship, relativism, right? To me, both of these traditions reject this. Let me give you one example. One of the prime rejections of critical race theory is the argument, well, at the time, people didn't know that enslavement was like bad. It was, you know, they just randomly lost those parts of the Bible that they took out in the slave Bible. Like, who knows what happened to Paul's epistles and to the story of Moses and stuff. I mean, it's a farce. Like, of course, people knew. That's why they took those things out of the Bible on the occasion that the enslaved were allowed to read or to study or to learn about scripture. Critical race theorists join abolitionists in saying, no, a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. From the moment someone lays their hand against anyone's will and they protest, from that moment all the way to letter from a Birmingham jail, Black Lives Matter, the whole 9 yards, things that are wrong, and they're wrong universally. And they're not wrong just in their context or out of their context. They're wrong in a transcendental sense of good and evil. However, if evil is a privation, that transcendental sense has to be ratcheted and put under the metaphysical priority of the good. And so there we see this kind of resistance of a kind of moral absolutism and a priority for what I'm going to talk about later that Benedict also talks about as regular familial discussion. That the way we work things out aren't by creating Kantian absolutes, but by sitting at the table, breaking bread, being in communion. The fifth is that they're both constructive and active. Again, I think this offends certain postmodern sensibilities, both in and out of the church. But both critical race theory and Catholic social teaching are not just criticisms, and they're not just looking askance at things. They both actually imagine something constructively new, and they try to build something like a new world. And I think that this imagination and building, when we really dig into it, it really is rooted in a kind of vision of divine love. We can see this in like King's beloved community, a theme that's repeated over and over in the documents, the founding, kind of documents of critical race theory. And of course, in Catholic social teaching, John Paul II's really great movement of the civilization of love. He put words like civilization and culture on things that weren't always culture of life, culture of death. So, we think of love or life or death or whatever, oftentimes the will or conscience in sort of individualist framing sometimes. But John Paul II and Ratzinger, he even talks about the conscience of the church. How does the church have a conscience? I thought consciences were psychologically proper to me and me only. No, the church's voice, her subtlety in being able to discuss this pluralistic sensibility, I think allows it to imagine a constructive and also take an active role in trying to build this beloved community, to build the civilization of love. I think Laudato Si is about as concrete as it gets. And I think that in many cases, works of direct action and mutual aid are also quite direct. Francis recently talked at the synodality conferences about the George Floyd movement here in the United States in similar terms. The sixth point is that they're both a critique of the political status quo. I know the conservative liberal thing is like a thing. It's not a useful analytic. Let's just be honest. It's not. And it's not even a useful analytic for like liberals or conservatives, to be perfectly honest. Like, it doesn't do a whole lot of work, and it mostly just works over the work that other people are doing, in my opinion. Sorry, I'm supposed to be talking about critical race theory. So that was me talking. Back to the point. Both critical race theory and Catholic social teaching are critics of modernity. Do they give the same critiques of modernity? No, I don't think they do. But they do it. The other thing they do is they're both critical of liberalism as a political philosophy and as a political doctrine, and in particular in critical race theory as a particular enactment and concept of law. Now, in Catholic social teaching, I don't think it gets quite as granular as that, but we can see the word liberalism used in a kind of pejorative way by a lot of the popes, especially like in the 50s and 60s and 30s. One thing I love about Catholic social teaching is that, yes, the church is responding to the world, and that's really important. But I love how they love to have anniversaries. So I find that a lot of Catholic social teaching, if you want to figure out why was this, it's the 25th anniversary of Rerum Novarum or the 90th anniversary. And so they love to kind of like they go back to the source and then work from there in the times as they are. And they kind of keep moving that way. The political status quo changes, but one of the more durable political status quo of the last century has been the endurance of liberalism. And we find very marked critiques, both in Catholic social teaching and in critical race theory, of that particular aspect of the modern project, liberalism, and especially in the limits of the secular liberal conception of the state. And so one of the most kind of, I say, ground level critiques that you can find in all radical Black thought is a deep distrust of secularism. And that can be whether you're on Team Prophet Elijah Muhammad next and NOI, or if you're in a more AME or in Black Catholicism, right? You can find it all across. They're both democratic and pluralistic in the sense that I think, on balance, on the whole, critical race theory over and against, for instance, Afro-nationalism, other forms of more authoritarian ideas of Black politics, and Catholic social teaching over against forms of integralism and things like that, they favor democracy over authoritarianism. And there isn't a better text on this authoritarianism than in my opinion, Fratelli Tutti, the one that just came out. It's not a vague issue brought up there. And they also favor a pluralistic sense of not only sociological pluralism, which I think is true, but in particular, I would say complexity over simplicity. So, they tend to say things like, okay, the predominant narrative is X, but it's not so simple. Let's make this a bit more complex. This often gets them into some kind of trouble. And I think it's important that they carry that point 5, that constructive and active imagination to go along with it. If we just complexify everything, sometimes I think we get into trouble, but hopefully you can take these on balance. Point 8 is that Afro/Latin Catholicism really cuts across and intersects. This is a point they both intersect. They include critical race theory and Catholic social teaching, include the unique experience of Latin American and African American churches, which includes Black Catholicism in the United States and across Afro-Latin countries and populations, and also liberation theology. I mean, if you want to get historical, I would just ask anybody to just read about Haiti. But if you don't want to get like that deep into it, read Father Cyprian Davis. Read his historical account of Black Catholicism in the United States. Read Father Brian Massengel's more recent work on the subject. Listen to Gloria Purvis's podcast, including with distinguished guests, like some who are in the room. Read Olga Segura's journalistic account of Black Lives Matter. Check out Bishop Edward K. Braxton, one of the most outspoken bishops on the subject matter of race. Listen to Sister Thea Bowman give an address to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Read Father Gustavo Gutierrez, a Dominican. Maybe go to Notre Dame, where he teaches third out of the year. Read Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Read Servant of God, Bartolomé de las Casas. We don't actually have to part from the larger realm of Catholic letters in order to find deep and meaningful intersections where the voices of, and I've left out, of course, the indigenous component, which has a place here as well. Certainly, the question of mestizaje makes this very complicated. But let's just say that, in my mind, Afro/Latin Catholicism is a place where we can see that there's an always already aspect to certain ways of thinking about critical race theory that is oftentimes not represented by its critics and even by some of its followers. The 9th point is that there are both forms of abolitionist anti-racism. And that's a big fancy way of saying they both are explicitly anti-racist in the sense that they think it should cease to exist. Here's Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 29. Every form of social or cultural discrimination and fundamental personal rights on the grounds of sex, race, color, social conditions, language, or religion must be curbed and eradicated as incompatible with God's design. That's the magisterium of the Catholic Church speaking. I don't find at a conceptual level any reason to distinguish the eradication of every form of social or cultural discrimination from the maybe more specific contextual project of abolitionism of both chattel state, Jim Crow, the carceral state, and all these other things. And so I think there's a deeper and longer argument to be made, but nonetheless, hopefully I've allowed you to kind of see where that intersection finds. 10th, and maybe most importantly for our gathering here today, because we're about to enter into some questions and responses. I don't know if I have answers, but some responses. Is that they're both autocritical coalitions. And by what I mean that autocriticism is that they're not, okay, let me be honest. There are certainly voices of critical theory or, that like to speak in a more magisterial way than others. Richard Delgado. Anyway, and there are certainly those who do the same thing and Catholic social teaching as well. And this isn't an ideological point. I've actually made some, I've studied some of Delgado to my benefit. And I've read certain accounts of, like I'll be honest, like Catholic social teaching, preferential option for the poor. Yes, of course. No question. Option for the poor. Opción para los pobres. Great. Okay. What does that mean? Right? I want to go a little bit deeper. Sometimes I just get swacked over that. So I was like, okay, no more. Let's talk about what these things mean and not just, make them into slogans or cliches. What I'm trying to say is that both critical race theory and Catholic social teaching at their best are deeply autocritical in a critical internal dialogue, coalitions of interest. Derek Bell wrote a really foundational article on this idea of making and building coalitions. Coalitions that would even surprise you, even in either in their formation or in the actual claims they make. Like, how many of you would have guessed that Derek Bell, the sort of godfather of critical race theory, really made his mark against critical legal studies by saying, look, I was an NAACP lawyer for Thurgood Marshall. I heard over 300 education cases. I know what I'm talking about. And now let me tell you that the Brown v. Board of Education that the NAACP took up and fought for in the Supreme Court was so watered down then, and now 20 years later has turned into busing and white flight and privatization, that it wasn't even worth the win we had in '54. That's Derek Bell. Now, people have to read to find out the fact that Derek Bell's opening remarks on the subject matter of integration was to say, how did this project, this civil rights project, this vision of a beloved community, how did it fail? That was his opening question. And it was a controversial question because there was plenty of people, I'm guessing probably Thurgood Marshall too, that said, it failed? Who are you to say it failed? Tell me where you come from in Pittsburgh. Let's see how there's a deep contestation to be had on that argument and on that. And so these autocritical discussions often create internal battles that you can see if you sit down with a Jesuit, a Dominican, and a Franciscan and talk about anything. What I mean is that, again, they both reveal a really strong capacity and also, most of all, a need for self-criticism and a need for true reconciliation, to come back into council, to reconcile us, to come back, to gather again, to come back to the table. Sometimes those reconciliations part ways. Critical legal studies and critical race theory have, I think, officially broken up. There are still critical legal studies arguments for why the critical race theory break was not legitimate, and now it's gotten popular again, and we got to hear again why they're so important. But we were right, and we will be vindicated in the end. There are still legal scholars making that argument. I want to hear that argument. I think that argument's important to keep in the journals. I think it's important as scholars for us to pay attention to that argument. We can find different readings of, like, Evangelium Vitae came out in 1995. Some people are like, he finally said the word abortion. We have the word now in our lexicon. This is great. And there are others saying, he finally said capital punishment in war beside the word abortion. We finally have these together. So the Bernardine whole cloth, and they created all kinds of political configurations in this country and around the world. But you can see that, like, the reception of Evangelium Vitae was like a reception almost in some cases of different documents in different orders of the church. Spes Salvi, a very famous theologian, said that it was written in 2 different colored pens, red and gold. One was Ratzinger, Benedict. The other one was the other people. Okay, I don't really buy that, but this is the kind of arguments that we're used to having as Catholics, right? We're used to people kind of accusing, like, oh, that's not really what they meant. What they really meant with this other thing, which wasn't in there, but we know it was there because, we're subtle readers. We have a vast tradition for reading that I think is available to everyone, but that creates a need for autocriticism, a need for coalition, a need for maybe what synodality, maybe that's what that means at some level as well. And these complex and mixed coalitions even create fractures between major figures of the same group. I think that I'm a big kind of hermeneutic and continuity kind of guy. I like to read, my John Paul II into my Benedict into my Pope Francis. Plus, in my lifetime, those are the only popes I've had, so that's kind of what I do. But I also have to admit that there are different forms there are different emphases, there are different charisms, and there are different decisions that in some cases I agree more or less with and whatnot. We can find the same thing, I think, the same kind of complexity within critical race theory between, for instance, Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, Kimberly Crenshaw, so on and so forth throughout the tradition. What these autocritical coalitions, though, call for is, in my view, what Ratzinger said was needed for bishops and theologians to be able to get along. So the premise of On Conscience is, do the bishops need to listen to the theologians when they come up with novel arguments? And on the other hand, do the theologians need to obey the authority of the bishops on matters of doctrine? And Benedict says, look, what matters is what Plato called regular familial discussion. In the bounds of regular familial discussion, in some sense, we can have every argument, we can have every discussion, we can talk about it. In the absence of it, no, you can't. You'll lose theology, and you'll lose the church. You'll lose everything. And I think that critical race theory has obviously entered into the public view for reasons that I frankly don't entirely understand, and others I think I understand. But maybe one of the blessings of it is that maybe we can have some regular familial discussion about it. We can discuss what we mean. If CRT has been resignified and changed into a new meaning that doesn't apply to Bell and Crenshaw and Delgado, well, that's news to me, and it's probably news to a lot of legal scholars. But okay, let's examine that and see if we need to create some new distinctions and whatnot. And to me, it's this intersection of regular familial discussion that I think we can find in every serious place of scholarship. There's a lot of colleagues here in the room from other departments, and I always find it funny when we try to talk to each other from our disciplines, in our hyper modern specializations, where we'll never get this. We know that, don't we, colleagues? Some of you are like, maybe. Okay, good. See, I couldn't even get that. We can't never get this. That's how far apart we are on everything. But I think we can get this, and that might be an overly general that like, so what, CRT and CST intersect on that? Everyone intersects on that. But isn't that beautiful that everyone perhaps can intersect on this regular familial discussion? So with that, with those 10 intersections, I've claimed with those 2 points of moderation preceding them, with that explanation of what I mean by intersection, and with my introductory notes, and of course, the opening clarifications, I submit myself to your scrutiny and invite some regular familial discussion. Thank you so much. I believe the questions they have a fancy moderating technology, so I will rely on them.
You guys feel free to submit your questions either from the QR code, or we also have some index cards there you guys can write down as well.
So QR, we also have index questions over there, and I think that would cover anyone who doesn't have a phone. So.
Are we theoretically allowed to raise our hands if we don't have our phone on us?
Yeah. There's the index cards, I think, are the analog version.
Yeah. Having the old-fashioned.
Yeah.
Thank
We're
you.
not allowed to call.
I only have a flip phone, so I wouldn't be able to do the.
I can't do QR codes.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess my iPad can do QR. So I'm lying.
Sure.
Okay, so the first question has to do with the Black Lives Matter movement and its intersection with Catholic social teaching.
Sure.
The specific question is, how can groups like Black Lives Matter be reconciled with Catholicism when they oppose the church on so many moral issues? Can you just expand on that?
Yeah. So how can Black Lives Matter? Sure. Yeah. So I assume the question is probably referring to the Black Lives Matter global organization, which is a distinct organization started by Patricia Cullors and a few of her colleagues. The story on that is there was a hashtag created after the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the killing of Trayvon Martin. And after that hashtag, Black Lives Matter, went viral, it created a kind of a zeitgeist that was also turned into a non-for-profit organization, right? And I just think it's really important to say that, you know, Black is beautiful, Black power, Black Lives Matter. I listened to D'Angelo's Black Messiah album on my way over here. The rhetoric, the American political rhetoric of abolitionism within the Black intellectual tradition, the Black artistic tradition, Black letters and song and more, it is not reducible, I would say, to a non-for-profit organization. It's true, by the way, that there are elements of even the Black Lives Matter global organization that if we're looking for solidarity and intersections, we can find. But it is true that we're probably not going to find as many as if we were just to go to a Black Lives Matter rally on the street and talk to people and say, why are you here? Why are you saying Black Lives Matter? Why does Black Lives Matter make sense morally as a statement of conscience to you? And I don't want to speak as a journalist because I'm not one, or anecdotally. But my imagination and my philosophical thought experiment is that most people aren't actually aware of Patricia Cullors and the hashtag that was started after the exoneration of George Zimmerman. And maybe they hadn't heard of Trayvon Martin. They only heard of George Floyd. Maybe they hadn't heard of, you know, some of the other cases. But their conscience was stirred, their heart was stirred, and they proclaimed Black Lives Matter. Look, there's a lot of bishops, there's a lot of priests who held those signs. And there were a lot of people who found a lot of consolation there. I'll say Bishop Sainz, I think, in El Paso, he wrote a beautiful pastoral letter that I would include in the canon of Catholic social teaching after the El Paso massacre. As a Mexican American, it was meaningful. And I'm, if you haven't noticed, I'm not Black, but I understood from my experience of El Paso, sitting in Vancouver, Canada, reading their manifesto about the Hispanic invasion of Texas. I understood and I felt down to my bone marrow that that when I say Black Lives Matter, I'm a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So I don't lose anything as a Tejano, as a Texican, as a Mexican-American, Chicano, whatever word they invent for us tomorrow, whatever. I don't lose anything in that exchange by saying that Black Lives Matter. So what I would say is that, you know, sure, you can dig into the roots of the non-for-profit organization, or you can join the moral voice of your brothers and sisters, both in and out of the church, and including, I would say, our dear brothers and sisters, there are more Black Catholics than there are members of the AME right now in this country. And I think that we can join their voices and every other voice, you know, that we need to. But that's how I would respond to that question.
Could you explain, can you give a couple concrete current examples of the ways in which CRT is opposed to liberalism? I know you mentioned that a little bit.
Yeah. So most of the opposition to liberalism and CRT are not super contemporary. A lot of them come from the 80s and 90s literature. So I don't know of any like really recent CRT examples from that, but I do know that in the 80s and 90s literature, most of the question of liberalism is, if liberalism is so good, then why did the Jim Crow South survive for so long in a supposed liberal democracy? You know, one of the points that Bell makes I think Crenshaw in the introduction makes, is that there was actually he also makes in his interest convergence article, but there's a few points where they talk about, like, it was actually in the interest of Red Scare anti-communist sentiment to end Jim Crow, because one of the main arguments that was used by communists against liberal democratic states was, look at the South and the United States in America. If this is freedom, how does that work down there? And so there was a compelling actual interest for status quo law and liberalism to kind of correct itself. But whenever it did, critical race theorists were quick to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. Maybe you corrected yourself out of an interest convergence in the 1960s. But the point is, how is this liberalism idea morally tenable whenever it's, you know, sat on its hands so many times others? So in many ways, it was a moral critique of the ability for liberalism to essentially survive. There was also, of course, the effect of what was World War II fought for. World War II is complicated because, you know, the communists and the liberals nations allied together to fight fascism, right? And this confrontation between fascism and got to be awkward to have like Stalin, you know, allying with you, but you know, this alliance between the USSR and England and France and of course Canada and the United States. A lot of the people who fought in that war were, of course, people of color. And when they came back, they said, we fought for freedom against fascism, against authoritarianism. And now I can't drink at the same water fountain. So a lot of the oppositions and the critiques of critical race theory of liberalism was, how could these concrete situations like the aftermath of World War II, how could these concrete situations like the creation of the Jim Crow state in the South, how could the non-free states before the Jim Crow, how could this exist if liberalism is supposedly so good, Locke tells us, so on and so forth. So that's where a lot of the skepticism comes from, but it's more historical. I don't know, frankly, a lot of what a contemporary example would be in this case. Yeah.
We've had a few questions that kind of bounce off of each other, or more or less similar. I'd like to just say two of them, just because I feel like they come out of different angles. So one of them is, what are some disconnects between CRT and Catholic social teaching? And then another angle to hit would be, could you address one of the issues of critical race theory that prevents it from being totally absorbed into Catholic social teaching entirely? Or do you believe that there's nothing that the Catholic Church should reject simply due to this untranslatability that you mentioned?
Interesting. Okay. I mean, those are both in their own way related, but in some ways separate questions. I like them both. Can you remind me of the first one though, just to make sure? I like it as much as I said I did. Yeah.
What are some disconnects between CRT and Catholic social teaching?
Yeah. So this is good. I mean, my first point is that I came to give a talk on the intersection of CRT and Catholic social teaching. I think it would be interesting and good to offer a talk of the non-intersections or even the conflicts between critical race theory and here I can speak of a contemporary version. So there's been a movement that has, in some sense, been critical of CRT called Afro-pessimism. I think the most popular author on this point would be someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates in some ways, a gentle version, I'd say, of Afro-pessimism. We can get much more pessimistic than that. King, in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, he tells the white clerics, look, do you understand? I am not a Black nationalist. I am not Marcus Garvey. Do you really want to work with that? You want to work with me. You want to work with your fellow Christian brother in Christ and all these kind of things. In other words, to me, there are interesting points of difference within, I guess, the Black intellectual tradition that we could also probably find within Catholic social teaching, but they definitely exist between each other as well. One point I would say is that critical race theory has, I don't think it's ever been able to break out of its originary genesis in law schools. It works really well in education because education has a lot to do with educational policy, and educational policy always interfaces with law. And so I think there are better places where critical race theory has been able to break out of law schools, but I don't see it, frankly, having a really great shelf life in other kinds of conversations. I would even say that, like, I don't think Cornel West is like dying to become a critical race theorist because he's a philosopher. What's the point? You know, for myself as a philosopher, I'm more interested, frankly, in philosophy of race than I am probably in critical race theory. I talk about it mostly because in order to understand philosophy of race, it does interface a bit with critical race theory, critical legal studies. So one of the limits of critical race theory is the fact that it's, I think, pretty confined to a specific discussion to law and American law. Like the Bible of this is Derek Bell's Race, Racism, and American Law. It's a really long book, and you can almost never get it except in legal libraries and research libraries and stuff. But so I think that's definitely a limit that Catholic social teaching doesn't have, right? Catholic social teaching is not limited to the law, and it doesn't necessarily discuss the scope of the law a lot of times. Another thing that I think is a little bit, Catholic social teaching, I think, teaches on faith and morals, like faith and morals, faith and morals, faith and morals. Critical race theory kind of assumes and almost works from these often unstated moral premises that they're taking from civil rights, abolitionist thought, Aquinas, Augustine, or whatever. But they're often premises that are a little bit hidden and not easy to find. And I think, frankly, sometimes the critical race literature can forget that what is legal and what is moral are not the same thing. And so we do see a conflation sometimes of legality and morality in critical race theory that I think is concerning and that I think Catholic social teaching doesn't suffer from. Vice versa, though, Catholic social teaching has to be global to all people of goodwill, which means it can't talk exactly about apartheid in South Africa when it was happening, which means it can't talk exactly about anti-Black white supremacy in the United States. In other words, it's never able to get quite that granular because the voice of the church has to remain catholicos. It has to remain universal. So in that sense, critical race theory, maybe its deficiencies can help, but that's not an intersection. That's a place where mutual kind of weak points sort of help each other. So that would be a third talk, but it's not the one I'm here to give necessarily, but it's an interesting idea. What was the second question?
The second one was, let me find it for a second.
It was like if CRT could be fully like assimilated into CST.
Yeah. Oh man, hold on.
While he's finding that, can we ask another quick one?
Okay, sure. Because I like that second question.
Could you address one of the issues of critical race theory that prevents it from being totally absorbed into Catholic social teaching entirely? Or do you believe that there's nothing that the Catholic Church should reject simply due to this, quote, untranslatability that you mentioned at the beginning?
Yeah, I just think this is a fascinating question. I think it's a difficult question because I think about it through like the lens of like interfaith dialogue, right? Clearly, Pope Francis has been signaling to us through the story of Francis and the Sultan and through any number of kind of metaphors, the Good Samaritan emphasis and stuff, that he wants us to think not only with both lungs, like John Paul II, to bring together the East and the West, but also in a different interfaith way. I think that's a very difficult discussion that we have to honor pastorally, but we have to enter into with care and with concern. I see that as a cousin of this question, which is critical race theory is not, in fact, as much as obviously Black Catholicism and the Black Catholic Church has a place within the history of Black letters in this country, it's not the total sum. And I struggle to this day with figuring out how to work with that. You know, on my podcast, I had an interesting discussion with Alessandra Harris, one of the co-editors and founders of Black Catholic Messenger, about my own struggles as, you know, the Mexican Mass and the Spanish Mass, and we call it the Mexican Mass, you know, and how to, and, you know, the need to have an enculturated faith on the one hand, and on the other hand, to remain Catholic and universal on the other. These are tensions that the question, I can't answer the question in a clear way, but I can say that question, I think, touches a really important nerve in why we might enter into constructive dialogue on these two things instead of doing that. The other problem, if I can just be really clear though, is, you know, critical race theory has a secularism problem. It's too many atheists. And they could stand to, I think, have a bit more religion in their project. And I think they put off people who are otherwise sympathetic because of this, sometimes, at least not so much in the tradition, but in the contemporary discussion, this kind of easy alliance with the old scientific Marxists and vulgar Marxists who I thought we broke up with, but they get along sometimes better and they break bread easier than they do sometimes with, you know, I come in and I'm like, I'm Catholic. And they're like, I don't like that, right? I want to feel welcome. And so there is that issue, but it's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah, there was one on what King would think of CRT. They mentioned that King emphasized judging someone on the quality of process, and then Crenshaw advocates for inequality of results. So do you have an opinion on what King would think of critical race theory?
Okay, I think this is the whole thing about equality of outcomes versus equality of, yeah. As far as I know, Jordan Peterson made that up. I don't think that's, I don't know exactly that distinction holds really well, but I'd like to read from you a section. Maybe I'll read to you a section if I can find it. Where actually critical race theorists, Kimberly Crenshaw and friends, they talk about this very specifically. In particular, they talk about the quotation of King's "I Have a Dream" speech and the not the content of the character, not the color of their skin. Needless to say, I mean, if you even just read the "I Have a Dream" speech, you'll know that the front end is about a bad check. It says, "I've come to Washington to collect the check that Lincoln wrote for me that didn't have money in the bank," and it was a bad check, and I'd like to collect on this check of emancipation. And of course, that's a really deep point, because you have to realize that, like, you know, the Emancipation Proclamation was not the 13th Amendment, nor the 14th Amendment, nor the 15th Amendment, nor did it end Jim Crow, nor did it integrate schools, nor, in other words, a lot of the impetus of critical race theory is saying, look, we've been through this multiple times in our history. They ended the transatlantic slave trade in the early 19th century, and chattel slavery ransacked the South until the 1860s, right, in the antebellum period. So the impulse of critical race theory, and I think the impulse that King, even in that speech, understood was that, you know, sometimes people write bad checks. And we want to be able to collect on those checks, not only the checks of the liberal state, but the natural right check of our dignity and our freedom as human beings. I really wish I could find the exact quote that shows you Crenshaw doing the work. Maybe ask another question, then I'll find it.
Would you like us to?
Yeah, go for it.
So first of all, this will likely be the last question.
Oh, sure, because I talk a lot.
And yeah, approaching on how long it takes for you to answer questions.
I know. I know. You need to cut me off.
Yeah. So the final one would be, does it help to consider the intersection of abolitionism and Catholic immigrants to the United States, especially in the South? If so, how exactly?
Wow. So there's already some work on not only the intersection, but the argument, as I understand it, and some contemporary abolitionist work, is that the carceral state and the abolition of the carceral state entails the abolition of its enforcement over the border. So that abolish ICE means end for-profit prisons, and these two things are linked, they're not separated. Why? Because ICE and for-profit prisons incarcerate people and they profit for them in various ways, so on and so forth. So I think this question is very much in line with the present day conversation between abolitionists of maybe an Angela Davis type of abolitionism and border politics, which right now, as you probably know, in this state, with the situation in Haiti, before that situation in Guatemala and Honduras, before that, the Bracero programs. I mean, the border is, I was born on the Rio Grande. I was born in Brownsville. I was born like right across from Matamoros, Mexico. I fished on that river as a kid. The border was always dangerous because there was bobcats and, you know, alligator gar and weird people and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And in Spanish, it's called the Rio Bravo. That means the bravo, mean, violent. What does it mean? What? Yeah, wild, dangerous river. The dangerous, mean, violent river. So it was never a very, like, I never thought it was open border. But there was a nice interchange of going to the Farmacia. The Winter Texans came and went, and it was a different border than it was. We also have, of course, the situation of the globalization of drug imports and exports, and the place of the inability of the Mexican state to secure the border with respect to, and really the society from respect to drug politics and things like that, corruption. I think we needed to be able to talk about all of it within the lens of abolitionism. And I think that King idea of a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere is a great analytic for that. I found my quote. So this is Crenshaw et al. Mainstream legal argument regarding race relations. This is written in 1995. Typically defended its position by appropriating Dr. King's injunction that a person should be judged by the content of his character rather than the color of his skin, and wedding it to the regnant ideologies of equal opportunity and American meritocracy. Faced with this state of affairs, liberal proponents of affirmative action in legal and policy arenas, who had just successfully won the formal adoption of basic anti-discrimination norms, soon found themselves in a completely defensive ideological posture. Affirmative action requires the use of race as a socially significant category of perception and representation. But the deepest elements of mainstream civil rights ideology had come to identify such race consciousness as racism itself, the old reverse racism charge. It's much older than what's on the news today. It was old in 95 because they were pointing backwards and stuff. So this thing of what would King say about that? King said a lot about that. Just read what he said about those things and read the way people have used King. You know, King was called a communist. He was called a disruptor. He was called an outsider. He was called violent. That he didn't decry the riots and the looting and everything people have said about activists these days, they said about King. And King said a lot of things back to him, including a letter from the Birmingham jail. So just check it out. And CRT, though, they knew about that. And they wrote about it explicitly. Go ahead. Oh, is that it?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, okay. Thank you, everyone.